Lecture 6, Imperialism and World War I. As the Industrial Revolution strengthened already powerful countries, these major world powers began to dominate the resources and markets in less powerful countries. In examining the Industrial Age of Imperialism, we will focus our attention on Africa and then on Asia. Then we will see how in the 1900s, the major world empires that promoted imperialistic policies began to crumble until they finally broke apart. The early 20th century World War I signaled the end of the four of these empires: the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. In examining this battle of the empires, we will briefly discuss World War I's causes and its victims. This lecture will conclude with a look at some of the art representative of this period, namely Expressionism and abstract art. Imperialism. Imperialism was the last and strongest stage of colonialism that began in the 1500s as major Western nations explored uncharted territory. When new lands were discovered, such as the Americas, colonies were established. These colonies were overseen by nations that were often thousands of miles away. During the age of imperialism, the desire and ability of these powerful Western nations to dominate their colonies grew. This growth was a direct result of the establishment of industrialized centers that needed raw materials from other countries in order to produce their products, and the desire of these highly industrialized countries for exotic goods, or at least goods they perceived as exotic. The rapid growth of colonies during the time of the Industrial Revolution is astonishing. According to William Roger Lewis in his study Ends of British Imperialism, the Scramble for Empire, Suez, and Decolonization, and I quote, "In the last decades of the 19th century and until 1914, Europe expanded more rapidly than at any other time. Between 1800 and 1880, the colonial empires added some 6,500,000 square miles to their domains. In the next 3 decades, the empires grew by another 8,655,000 square miles, extending European sway to over 85% of the world's land surface, up from 65%. The British Empire alone, small little British Empire, extended over 1/4 of the globe and over 1/4 of its population." The Conquest of Africa. One large landmass that European nations scrambled to dominate and control was Africa. During the late 1800s to the beginning of World War I, began in 1914, Africa was divided into 13 colonies and protectorates by competing Western nations, including Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Portugal, Belgium, and Spain. And in your transcript, I provide you a map of colonial Africa in 1897. And then I contrast that map in your transcript with another map that indicates when these lands gained their independence. Much injustice occurred during the time when Europeans scrambled to divvy up Africa. One territory in particular that was known for tremendous crimes was personally owned by the Belgian King Leopold II. King Leopold privately founded and operated the African Congo Free State. During his rule, the Congolese were treated as slaves. The reason for the abuse was greed. In order for King Leopold and those who worked for him to profit from Congo's supply of ivory and rubber, millions of Congolese were enslaved. A frequent punishment for slaves who did not collect enough raw material was rape, burning, mutilation, especially by cutting of hands, and even murder. Official census data indicates that as a result of the brutal treatment, the Congolese experienced, and I quote, "a population that was estimated to be between 20 to 30 million people at the beginning of the colonial era was reduced to 8.5 million in 1911. That's over half of people who were killed during this brutal treatment or died as a result of the brutal treatment. It is possible that King Leopold was not fully aware of the abuses of the Congolese people enslaved to the Belgians, since during his 23-year reign, over Congo, he never once visited his territory. In 1908, the people of Belgium responded to the tremendous injustice perpetrated against the Congolese by taking away the Congo Free State from King Leopold and transforming the territory into a colony of Belgium. China and the Opium Wars. Ever since the Silk routes that Marco Polo traveled in the 13th century, China and Far Eastern countries were associated with exotic goods. The Romans in the 1st century AD used these routes, the Silk routes, as attested to by Pliny the Elder, who lived from 23 to 79 AD. And Pliny the Elder attests that in his Natural History. Both the Romans and the British wanted, among other goods, the silk which the Chinese were famous for making. The British were especially intent on controlling China in order to profit by selling Chinese silks, tea, porcelain, and other like goods. The Chinese did not, as a whole, benefit from this economic relationship. This was because part of the economic relationship involved Chinese purchasing and using the addictive British product of opium. When the Chinese government attempted to prevent the British from importing opium into their lands to be sold to the Chinese, the British responded by going to war against the Chinese. These wars are logically named the Opium Wars, and there were two of them. The first Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842. This war ended in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanking. According to this treaty, England was to be paid by the Chinese for opium lost during the conflict, was allowed to trade at Chinese ports, and Hong Kong was ceded to the British. Hong Kong was not returned to the Chinese until 1997. The Second Opium War lasted from 1856 to 1860. This war also ended with a series of treaties that collectively are called the Convention of Peking of 1860. According to China's 1860 treaty with Britain, China was required to financially compensate the British for their losses incurred in the war. British ships were permitted to transport Chinese to British colonies, who would then pay for the journey by working in the colonies, and certain Chinese lands were ceded to the British. Imperialist Japan. During the late 1800s to the early 1900s, many Asian countries became controlled by Western powers. By 1907, the French had taken control over much of Southeast Asia, named French Indochina. The map in your transcript depicts the extent of French imperialism in Southeast Asia. Today, the territories of Annam, Tonkin, and Cochin China are part of Vietnam. The map also shows lands that the British controlled. Unlike other Asian countries that became subject to Western imperialist powers, Japan was able to imitate the imperialist practices of the West to such an extent that in the late 1800s it became an imperialist empire itself. Two significant treaties that signaled the entry of Japan into the Western world of commerce were the 1854 Kanagawa Treaty between Commodore Matthew C. Perry of the United States Navy and the Tokugawa shogun, and the 1858 Treaty of Amity and Commerce between the United States and Japan. Prior to these treaties, and since the 1600s, Japanese ports were closed to foreign vessels. Upon signing the treaties, Japan changed its isolationist policy by opening its ports to the West, beginning with the United States of America. Not only did Japan open its ports to the West, but also Japanese opened their minds to the Western practice of imperialism. Soon, Japan began relating to China in a similar way as the British did during the two Opium Wars. In 1895, Japan emerged victorious from a war it fought with China called the First Sino-Japanese War. At the end of the war, China officially recognized the independence of Korea and ceded to Japan the Liaodong Peninsula, Taiwan, and the Penghu Islands. This is similar to what China did after it lost to the British during the First Opium War, when Hong Kong was given to the British. Another similarity was after both Britain's Opium Wars with China and Japan's slightly later war with China, China was obligated to pay a substantial reparation fee to Britain and then to Japan. Japan's ability to beat China in war gave Japanese rulers confidence that they could also emerge victorious if they went to war with the Russian Empire. At the end of the Russo-Japanese War, lasted 1 year, 1904-1905, about 1 year, Japan once again emerged as the victor. The Portsmouth Treaty at the end of the war mandated that certain Russian-controlled territories in Chinese lands, including the important Port Arthur, be given over to Japan. World War I, 1914 to 1918. The competing imperialistic ambitions led to the breakdown of the balance of power that the Congress of Vienna of 1815 had intended. Two rival alliances formed out of the country that had, at the time of the Congress of Vienna, committed themselves to unity: the Triple Alliance of the German Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and Italy, and the Entente powers, the British Empire, France, and the Russian Empire. In 1914, the increasing friction between these two competing alliances ignited into World War I. At the time of the war, the Triple Alliance became known as the Central Powers, due to the location of the German Empire and Austro-Hungarian empires, and the Entente powers were named the Allies. At the end of the war, 4 of the 5 empires at war came to an end and were dismantled: the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. The 5th, the British Empire, would of its own accord, voluntarily, as influenced by international pressure, dismantle its empire by granting freedom to its former colonies. The war's immediate cause is traceable to 1908. In 1908, the Austro-Hungarian Empire annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, which it had been occupying since 1878. Prior to the occupation and annexation, Bosnia and Herzegovina had been part of the Islamic Ottoman Empire. Not only did this annexation irritate the Ottoman Empire, that, due to its political and military weakness, was called the sick man of Europe, but it also angered the powerful Russian Empire and the Bosnia-Herzegovina's nearby neighbor, the Kingdom of Serbia. A few years later, in 1914, the tension between two military alliances of the Entente powers and the Central Powers reached a breaking point. On June 28th of 1914, a Serbian nationalist assassinated the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In response, the Austro-Hungarian Empire issued an ultimatum to the Kingdom of Serbia. The Kingdom of Serbia reacted by rejecting the ultimatum. Exactly a month later, on July 28, 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war against Serbia. Soon all of Europe would be engulfed in a world war that pitted the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire against the British Empire, France, and the Empire of Russia. After the German Empire sunk a number of U.S. merchant ships, which the Germans believed were directly aiding the Allies, the United States, under the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, entered World War I on the side of the Allies on April 6, 1917. After millions of combatants and civilians were killed, the war ended on November 11, 1918, Armistice Day. The total number of war casualties is estimated to be around 9.5 million men. 15 million more men were wounded, and about 9 million others were taken as prisoners of war. This figure does not include millions of civilians who also perished during the war. For example, 1 million innocent American Christian 1 million innocent Armenian Christian civilians were killed with tacit approval by the Islamic Ottoman Empire, which in 1915 issued an anti-Christian law of deportation. Early 20th century art. We will now look at art created shortly before and after the turn of the 19th century, beginning with the various styles of Expressionism and ending with styles of abstraction. Expressionism. Unlike Impressionism, that beginning with the material world captures the artist's first and hazy recognition of objects he perceives, Expressionism first begins with the artist's mind and emotional states through which he interprets what he sees. For this reason, the forms depicted by Expressionism, he's expressing his emotions, These forms appear distorted, and the use of color by expressionists can be startling to represent the emotions within us. The physical reality that is being depicted by these artists were understood as means by which the artist is conveying his emotional state, in other words, his inner mood and subjective feelings. Since the artist's political environment was characterized by a high degree of tension that resulted in a war, and a world war, it is interesting to note that inner emotional world that artists depict seem often fear or anxiety based. This is very evident in the following two works, which is on your transcript of early Expressionism. And it's the first one I show is Edvard Munch the Scream. He's a Norwegian expressionist. And Franz Marc, a German expressionist, and his is more abstract, is called Fighting Forms. Fauvism. Artists of this form of expressionism, called Fauvism, displayed their emotional state by even more starkly contrasting colors and by distorting forms to an extreme. The art critic Louis Vosset found this work so disturbing that he called the artist Fauve, which in French means the wild beasts. Henri Matisse was a French Fauvist, and he's famous for many paintings. One in particular is very interesting. It's called The Portrait of Madame Matisse, or The Green Line. Another French Fauvist is André Derain. Die Bruck was a German form of expressionism that, like the Fauvists, used color in odd ways and distorted forms. The emotional intensity captured within these paintings of Die Bruck school is even greater than the works by the Fauvists. And among the artists are included Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, he's a German Die Bruck artist, and Emil Nolde. Abstraction. The word abstraction comes from Latin words to draw or to take away from. In order for me to think in an abstract manner, consequently, I must strip away materially based images from my mind in order to think about immaterial concepts. When artists paint in an abstract manner, they likewise abstract from the physical matter, strip that physical matter away they see in their minds in order to depict abstract mathematical shapes. Cubism is an example of early abstract art. A French cubist who is particularly famous is Georges Braque, an early cubist. Pablo Picasso, of course, is one of the most famous cubists from Spain. Futurism. The abstract art style Futurism sought to, according to Filippo Tommaso Marinetti's The Foundational Manifesto of Futurism, and I quote, glorify the love of danger, the custom of energy, the strength of daring, glorify war, destroy museums, libraries, and fight against moralism, feminism, and all utilitarian cowardice, end of quote. And two artists of that school are Umberto Boccioni, an Italian futurist, and Angelo de Guidici, also an Italian futurist. Dada. The Dada abstract style was a reaction to the systematic machine-based killings of World War I. The artists who formed themselves into the Dada movement objected to war and, unlike some futurists, refused to glorify war. Their protest was expressed by nihilism. In their art, they strove to depict life as meaningless by choosing objects that, to most people of the time, rationally does not make sense to be considered as art. For example, a urinal. Marcel Duchamp, a French Dada artist, just actually took a urinal, put it on display, and called it a fountain, and then signed his name on it. De Stijl. The Dutch Piet Mondrian is known for an abstract style of art called De Stijl that is characterized not by nihilism, not that under the most basic reality in the world is nothingness, but rather by mathematical rationality, evocative of peace. In his paintings, and you can look at the transcript for this, notice there are no diagonal lines or bars. This is because he associated diagonal lines and bars with violence. In contrast, with the immense violent political upheavals around him, Mondrian wanted people to be confronted with peaceful, abstract art. God bless.